The death clock. The flea market was sprawling, noisy, and cluttered, a carnival of forgotten things. Old books with frayed spines, mismatched teacups, and cracked mirrors stared back at Jessica as she wandered from one booth to the next. She wasn't even supposed to be here, just a random turn down a side street while avoiding traffic had led her to this place. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly sweet, like candied apples left out too long. Her fingers brushed against a silk scarf, a tarnished silver brooch, then a small wooden box, its edges chipped and stained. Inside the box, tucked in faded velvet, was the pocket watch. It wasn't particularly beautiful. The brass casing was scratched, the chain dull, and the glass face slightly fogged. But something about it stopped her. The numbers on the face were painted in an old, almost Gothic style, the kind you might see in a clock tower from centuries past. The second hand twitched, just barely, as if deciding whether to keep moving. Jessica felt a chill, not the type that made you shiver, but the kind that crept up your spine when you realized someone was staring at you from across a room. She shook it off. "How much for this?" she asked the vendor, a wiry man with a face like dried leather. He looked up from his book, his gray eyes narrowing at the watch. $20, he said, his voice gravelly, like he hadn't spoken to anyone all day. Jessica hesitated. The watch was old, sure, but $20 felt steep for something this battered. Still, she couldn't put it down. Her fingers lingered on the chain, which was cooler than it should have been in the late afternoon heat. She handed over the money, ignoring the vendor's sly grin. As she walked away, she swore she heard him mutter, "Good luck." But when she turned back, his head was already buried in his book. At home, she set the watch on her coffee table and forgot about it for most of the evening. It wasn't until later, after 2 glasses of wine and a half-hearted attempt to clean her apartment, that she noticed it again. The second hand had started moving. Slowly, but steadily. Jessica frowned. It wasn't running earlier at the market, she was sure of it. She picked it up, inspecting the intricate hands and the almost hypnotic tick-tick-tick. Then she noticed the time. 11:59. But it wasn't a normal 11:59. The hands weren't pointing toward midnight, they were moving backward. She blinked, thinking maybe the wine was playing tricks on her. She watched the second hand twitch back one tick, then another. She couldn't explain it, but the sight made her stomach churn. Her phone buzzed, breaking the spell. It was a text from her ex, "Mike, hope you're doing okay. Just wanted to say hi." Jessica rolled her eyes. He dumped her 2 months ago after a blowout fight over a work trip that turned out to be a weekend with someone named Amber. Jessica had blocked him on everything except her phone. Why hadn't she blocked his number yet? Out of habit, she tapped out a short reply, "Lose my number." Then, for good measure, she added, "Go to hell." She hit send and tossed the phone onto the couch. The watch began ticking faster. Jessica froze, the sound now sharp, insistent, as if the thing were alive and angry. She picked it up, heart pounding. The minute hand jerked backward, landing at 11:58. She stared, her mind racing for an explanation. She hadn't wound it. It didn't have batteries. Was this some kind of antique mechanism resetting itself? That had to be it. But as she stared into the tiny, delicate face, she felt the same chill she'd felt at the market. This time it didn't go away. The next morning, Jessica woke up groggy and disoriented, the events of the previous night swirling in her memory like fog. The watch was on her nightstand, still ticking backward. 11:55. She didn't have time to dwell on it. She was running late for work, and the coffee machine had decided to spite her by breaking down. The day only got worse from there. Her boss called her out for missing a deadline, her coworker accidentally spilled coffee on her desk, and by lunch, Jessica was ready to scream. As she walked back to her car after work, she saw a man fumbling with his wallet near the parking meter. He looked frazzled, his hands shaking as he searched for change. Without thinking, Jessica grabbed a dollar bill from her purse, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it at his feet. "There," she muttered, walking away before he could thank her, or worse, ask for more. She felt a flicker of guilt but shrugged it off. It wasn't like she owed him anything. When she got home, the watch read 11:50. The second hand was twitching frantically now, as though trying to break free. Jessica felt her chest tighten. She turned on the TV to drown out the ticking, but it didn't help. The sound was in her head now, gnawing at her thoughts. What was it counting down to? And why did it seem to speed up every time she did something selfish or cruel? By midnight, Jessica was pacing her living room, her anxiety coiling tighter with every backward tick. She couldn't shake the feeling that the watch was watching her, judging her, waiting for her to mess up again. The following day began with a heavy sky, thick with the promise of rain. Jessica barely noticed as she stumbled through her morning routine, her thoughts consumed by the watch. It sat on her dresser now, ticking softly, almost innocently, as if it wasn't the source of her spiraling dread. She avoided looking at it directly, but her ears caught every faint tick, every backwards lurch of the hands. 11:45. 5 minutes gone in less than 24 hours. The math didn't add up, and it terrified her. She took the watch with her to work, shoving it into the bottom of her bag, as though distance from her body could mute its presence. The day passed in a haze of frustration, missed emails, petty arguments with coworkers, and an overwhelming sense that everyone was against her. By the time Jessica got home, her patience had eroded to nothing. Her neighbor's dog, a yappy little terrier, barked incessantly as she unlocked her apartment door. It was like nails on a chalkboard. "Shut up," she snapped, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. The barking stopped, and she smirked, triumphant. But as she stepped inside and tossed her bag on the couch, she heard it, the ticking, louder now, angry. She dug the watch out and stared at the face. 11:42. Another 3 minutes. Her stomach dropped. Jessica sat down, holding the watch like it might explode. "What do you want from me?" she muttered, her voice shaking. It wasn't just counting time, it was counting her. Every selfish thought, every harsh word, every time she acted out of spite or indifference, the hands ticked backward. And it was speeding up. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a weird coincidence, or her mind playing tricks. She'd Google it, figure out if this kind of clockwork mechanism existed. There had to be a logical explanation. But deep down, she knew the truth. The vendor's smirk, the watch's eerie chill, it wasn't a coincidence. She was caught in something far darker than she could comprehend. Determined to prove herself wrong, Jessica decided to test it. If the watch punished her for bad actions, would it reward her for good ones? She grabbed her purse and headed back to the street where she'd scolded the man the day before. He wasn't there, but a homeless woman sat on the curb, her hands trembling as she held out a coffee cup. Jessica hesitated. She didn't want to give up the cash she'd set aside for groceries, but the thought of the watch ticking faster pushed her forward. She dropped a $10 bill into the cup. The woman's face lit up, her gratitude spilling out in a soft, trembling, "Thank you." Jessica walked away quickly, her heart racing. She pulled the watch from her bag and stared at the hands. 11:42. Nothing changed. The air felt like it had been sucked out of her lungs. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Was it broken? Or did it only care about her failures? Back at home, she opened her laptop and frantically searched for anything similar: cursed objects, haunted clocks, superstitions. The results were a mess of myths and conspiracy theories, none of them helpful. One article caught her eye, though. It was about a painting said to bring misfortune to its owners. The journalist had interviewed someone who claimed that the only way to escape the curse was to destroy the object, but doing so came at a price. Jessica's throat tightened. She glanced at the watch, still ticking, mocking her. Could she risk it? The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke. Rain lashed against her windows, and lightning lit up the room in brief, blinding flashes. Jessica grabbed the watch and headed to the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the counter, next to her heaviest frying pan. She raised the pan above her head, ready to bring it crashing down. But she froze. A memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. Her grandmother's voice, soft and steady, telling her as a child, "Every action has weight, Jess. Be careful what you choose to carry." Destroying the watch might free her, or it might make things worse. She didn't know. And wasn't that the point? That was the weight, the cost of her choices. Her hands shook as she lowered the pan. She spent the night staring at the watch, unable to sleep. 11:39. The hands kept moving backward, slowly but surely, as though taunting her. By the third day, Jessica was unraveling. The watch had become a living thing in her apartment, its steady ticking louder than her thoughts. 11:37. She had lost 8 minutes since buying it, and no matter what she did, kindness, silence, even desperate apologies whispered into the void, the hands never stopped their relentless march backward. The rain had cleared, but the city felt heavier, its usual noises muted, its corners darker. Jessica walked through the streets like a ghost, avoiding people, afraid that any wrong word or action might steal another precious second. She felt the weight of her existence in a way she never had before. Every choice, every impulse was a thread in some vast, unforgiving web. The watch had stripped her of her illusions. She found herself wandering back to the flea market, hoping against hope that the vendor would be there. She needed answers. Or maybe she just needed someone to blame. But the market was empty, the stalls abandoned, as though it had never existed. The spot where she had bought the watch was just a cracked stretch of asphalt. Her chest tightened, panic bubbling up. What if there was no escape? She returned home, the silence of her apartment like a tomb. 11:36. One more minute gone. Jessica threw the watch across the room, her scream raw and guttural. It hit the wall with a sickening clatter and fell to the floor, unbroken. She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't take it anymore, the constant second-guessing, the fear that every moment was a step closer to midnight. Her phone buzzed, breaking the suffocating stillness. A message from her sister, Emily. "Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" Jessica stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She hadn't spoken to Emily in months, not since their argument at Thanksgiving. Jessica had been sharp, cutting Emily down with words she hadn't meant but had never apologized for. She thought about ignoring the message. But then she glanced at the watch, lying on the floor, and the weight of its ticking pressed on her chest. She called Emily. The line rang twice before her sister picked up. "Jess? Is that you?" Jessica's voice cracked as she spoke. "Yeah, it's me. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." There was a pause on the other end, and then Emily's voice softened. "I've missed you." They talked for hours, their conversation peeling back layers of old wounds and rebuilding something fragile but real. When Jessica hung up, her heart felt lighter. She looked at the watch. 11:36. No change. Her relief shattered. If making amends didn't stop the countdown, then what was the point? What did the watch want from her? The frustration boiled over, and she grabbed the cursed object, storming into the bathroom. She filled the sink with water and shoved the watch under the surface, holding it down like she was drowning an enemy. The ticking grew louder, impossibly loud, filling the room with a sound that didn't belong. The water in the sink turned murky, swirling with shadows that weren't her own. Jessica yanked the watch out, her hands trembling, water dripping onto the floor. The face of the watch was unchanged, but her reflection in the glass looked back at her, distorted and wrong. Her own eyes seemed to accuse her, as if the watch had become a mirror to her soul. Jessica fell back against the wall, clutching the watch like a lifeline. The air around her felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. She realized then that the watch wasn't counting down to her death. It was showing her how much of her life she'd already wasted on anger, selfishness, and regret. Midnight wasn't an end, it was a reckoning. She didn't sleep that night. The minutes slipped away, and by dawn, the watch read 11:31. 5 minutes left. 5 minutes to prove that her life had meaning. She left her apartment with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she had to try. The city unfolded before her like a labyrinth, each street a potential answer or dead end. She gave what little cash she had to a street musician, helped an elderly man carry his groceries, and picked up trash from the sidewalk. None of it felt like enough. The watch ticked on. 11:30. Jessica found herself standing on the edge of a bridge, the water below reflecting the pale morning light. She looked down at the watch, its hands trembling, as if alive. Was this what it wanted? A final act of sacrifice to stop the countdown? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A young boy, no older than 7, stood a few feet away, staring at her with wide, tearful eyes. "Miss, I can't find my mom," he said, his voice small and scared. Jessica's heart clenched. She knelt down, her voice trembling. "It's okay. We'll find her together." As she held the boy's hand and walked with him along the bridge, she felt something shift inside her, a quiet, unfamiliar peace. The watch in her pocket was warm, almost comforting, its ticking softer now, like a heartbeat. When the boy's mother came running toward them, her relief palpable, Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She pulled out the watch and looked at the face. 11:30. It hadn't moved, but for the first time, she didn't feel the suffocating urgency. She stood on the bridge as the boy and his mother disappeared into the crowd. The watch ticked on, a mystery she might never solve. Maybe the time left didn't matter. What mattered was how she chose to spend it. Jessica turned and walked away, leaving the bridge and its reflections behind. The weight of the moment stayed with her, a lingering imprint like a bruise on her soul. The watch's presence no longer felt malevolent, but its mystery persisted. Jessica wasn't foolish enough to think she was free of it, nor did she believe she had fully deciphered its purpose. Midnight still loomed, an undeniable point on the horizon. Yet for the first time since she'd bought the cursed object, she didn't feel helpless. She felt something else instead, determination. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jessica moved with an urgency she couldn't quite articulate, tying up loose ends, making choices with an intensity she hadn't known she was capable of. She donated the remainder of her savings to a local shelter, ignored the sideways glances when she volunteered to scrub the floors, and stayed late helping organize supplies. Every act felt significant, yet it all seemed futile when she checked the watch before bed. 11:29. She'd lost another minute. Jessica couldn't sleep. Her mind churned through every action, every decision. Was she still falling short? Was she missing the point entirely? She lay in the dark, listening to the relentless ticking, a sound that burrowed into her skull. The minutes she had left felt impossibly heavy. By the time dawn broke, she was exhausted but resolute. She realized the futility of simply reacting to the watch. If she let it dictate her actions, wasn't she just surrendering to fear all over again? Jessica decided she wouldn't waste another second being afraid. She called Emily again, this time just to talk, really talk. They laughed about old memories and promised to see each other soon. Jessica then dialed a few estranged friends, their voices tentative at first but softening as the conversations unfolded. For the first time in years, she felt connected. Hours passed, the city's pulse rising with the sun. Jessica wandered its streets, stopping to admire murals she'd ignored before, savoring the scent of fresh bread wafting from a bakery, smiling at strangers who passed her by. The ticking of the watch was still there, but it no longer filled her with dread. It was late afternoon when she found herself in a small, overgrown park, tucked between two towering buildings. She sat on a creaking bench, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves. She pulled the watch from her pocket and studied it. 11:29. No change. She laughed, a quiet, hollow sound. "You're stubborn," she said aloud, though the words felt as much for herself as for the watch. The laughter faded, and a thought settled over her, a question she hadn't dared to ask until now. What if the watch wasn't measuring her sins? What if it was measuring her understanding of life itself? She'd spent so much time trying to undo her mistakes, but what if that wasn't the point? Jessica closed her eyes, letting the moment stretch. For the first time, she allowed herself to sit with the uncertainty, to accept that she might never fully understand the rules of this strange game. And in that acceptance, she felt something shift, a quiet surrender, not to the watch, but to life. When she opened her eyes, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the park. The watch in her hand felt lighter, its ticking softer. She glanced down. 11:28. The minute had shifted. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jessica rose from the bench, her heart steady. Midnight would come, as it would for everyone, but she would no longer spend her remaining time fearing it. Instead, she would live, not because the watch demanded it, but because she finally understood the weight and beauty of every fleeting second. As she walked away from the park, the ticking faded into the ambient hum of the city, a sound she no longer feared but carried with her, like a rhythm to her newfound resolve.